You know, we hear so much about immigration enforcement these days, about who's being targeted, right? And the tactics, the reasons behind it all. But what is the reality? What's actually happening on the ground is, well, pretty different from the story we usually get. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into exactly that, the recent actions, the policies of immigration and customs enforcement, ICE, and explore what it all means, the broader implications. Our goal here is simple: cut through the noise. We want to pull out the key insights from expert analysis, from the actual data, give you a shortcut, really, to be properly informed on this really critical issue. And the insights for this deep dive, they come mainly from a detailed conversation with the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute. And honestly, some of what we found might surprise you. We'll look at who ICE is really detaining versus, who they say they're targeting. The kinds of tactics being used out on the streets, some pretty unusual stuff. The conditions inside detention centers, which are frankly shocking. And the ripple effects on civil liberties, things like birthright citizenship even. Plus, we'll hit the actual data on immigrant crime rates versus the narrative. And the economic side of things, too. Big consequences there.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. There's a lot to unpack. But the aim isn't just to know what's happening, but crucially, why it matters. We really hope you listen critically, connect these pieces.
Okay, let's get into it then. The administration, they consistently say the goal is targeting the worst of the worst, right? The violent criminals posing a threat. But when you look at the actual data, the facts on the ground, what's the real story? Can you unpack that for us?
Right. Well, the gap between that stated goal and the reality is pretty stark. What's really driving things often are these arbitrary quotas. There's an organizational goal set by the White House, actually, for ICE and other federal agencies involved to arrest about 3,000 people a day.
3,000 a day?
Yeah. So that inevitably creates a quantity over quality situation. They need to hit the numbers. And you see it plain as day in the arrest data. Take June, for example. Over 70%, 0% of the people ICE arrested had no criminal convictions at all.
70%? Wow.
Yeah, it completely shifts the perspective, doesn't it? It shows this huge disconnect between the rhetoric and the actual practice. And if you drill down further, looking just for violent criminal convictions, that number plummets to only about 5% or 6%.
5 or 6%.
Exactly. So the people highlighted in press releases, those are really the exceptions, not the rule. So what about the convictions that do exist for the others? Well, the majority, around 53%, fall into 3 buckets. Immigration offenses themselves, affect offenses, which are kind of like public order things, or nonviolent vice crimes, think prostitution, simple drug possession, maybe paraphernalia. And of course, crossing the border without authorization is technically a crime, but that's not usually what officials mean when they talk about, protecting communities from dangerous people.
Right. So that gap is huge.
Yeah.
The vast majority are not the violent criminals we hear about, which leads to the next question. If the focus isn't really on violent crime, what does this quantity over quality approach actually look like on the street? What kind of tactics are being used?
Well, the tactics are pretty unprecedented in scale and type. We're seeing ICE and Border Patrol, too, going into workplaces, businesses, Home Depots, farms, or just stopping people on the street, demanding papers, proof of citizenship from pretty much anyone they encounter. We've even heard specific reports like Border Patrol agents in Los Angeles asking people, what hospital were you born at? I mean, this is happening deep inside the U.S., not just at the border.
Asking what hospital you were born at in L.A.
Mm-hmm. And the way these arrests happen is also deeply concerning. Officers often wear masks, they're in plain clothes, no visible badge or ID sometimes, using unmarked cars.
So like you wouldn't know who they were?
Exactly. To someone on the street, it just looks like a kidnapping. It doesn't look like legitimate law enforcement. Now, ICE says this secrecy is for officer protection, but honestly, that logic seems backwards. It actually leads to more danger for the officers.
How so?
Because the public has no idea who these people are. If someone in jeans and a t-shirt grabs you, your instinct is to push them away, right? And that can immediately escalate into an assault charge against you. And there's another critical danger this creates for the public. It makes it easy for people to impersonate ICE officers.
Oh, right.
Yeah, we have documented cases, sexual predators, thieves, even just people trying to scare their neighbors pretending to be ICE. And that's likely underreported because victims are often terrified to speak up.
That's incredibly disturbing. It really hits the core idea of, accountable, transparent policing. When law enforcement doesn't identify itself, that's fundamental. Okay, so we've talked about the tactics. Now, what about where people are held? The detention facilities, we hear about severe overcrowding. What are the numbers and what are the conditions actually like inside?
The situation inside is frankly dire. Congress has funded about, let's say, 41,000 detention beds for immigration purposes.
Okay.
But ICE is currently holding almost 60,000 people.
60,000. In space for 41.
Precisely. The math just doesn't work.
Yeah.
And the result is these inhumane, overcrowded conditions. We're talking people literally jammed into cells, sleeping on bare concrete floors. Access to basics like showers. Some go a week or more without one. Critical medications for chronic conditions, diabetes, high blood pressure often aren't provided. Food and water can be limited. And the sanitation, picture one toilet for maybe 35 or 40 men.
One toilet for 40 men.
Yeah. These conditions are, and this is not an exaggeration, worse than pretty much any prison holding hardened criminals in the U.S. And tragically, people are dying. We've already seen over a dozen deaths in detention just this year because of these conditions and lack of care.
That's horrific. Is this just mismanagement, lack of resources?
No, and this is critical. It's not an accident. It's not just lack of funds. It appears to be a deliberate policy. Stephen Miller, a key architect of these policies, has basically said the goal is to make conditions so bad that people give up.
Give up.
Give up their legal rights, abandon their asylum claims, stop fighting deportation, choose to leave even if they might have a legal right to stay, like being eligible for a green card. Make it unbearable.
And on top of that, we're hearing reports that members of Congress trying to do oversight, trying to see these places, are being unlawfully blocked.
That's right. Preventing oversight seems to be part of the strategy, too.
This is all deeply troubling. And it leads to an even more alarming idea that's been floated: the possibility of deporting naturalized Americans or even U.S.-born citizens, which really raises the stakes, doesn't it? This idea of an assault on civil liberties.
Yeah.
If it starts there, who's actually next?
Exactly. The whole discussion around potentially ending birthright citizenship, many see that as a kind of test run.
A test run for what?
To limit who has citizenship. Who has the standing to challenge the government? It's not ultimately just about immigrants. It's about weakening the rights of potentially millions. Think about it. If birthright citizenship is undermined, how do you prove you're a citizen? Suddenly, you might need to prove your parents' citizenship or their legal status when you were born, maybe even go back further.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It would be. And when officials say, oh, it wouldn't be retroactive, well, history suggests that's nonsense. These kinds of changes almost always expand over time, and you can see the political motives. There have been explicit comments about wanting to strip opponents of their rights, their ability to speak out or challenge the administration. Remember the questions raised about President Obama's citizenship or Kamala Harris's? More recently, even Elon Musk was targeted with threats of denaturalization after criticizing the administration.
Right, I remember that.
The implication is pretty clear. If they can question the citizenship of powerful people, they can question anyone's. And the end game here could be no due process on removal. Imagine an ICE agent's word being enough to deport someone immediately.
Immediately. Without a court.
Potentially. Even sending them to foreign prisons indefinitely. People who committed no crime, people who entered legally. We've already seen cases documented, like Venezuelans who were legally in the U.S. being rounded up and sent to prisons in El Salvador with no charges, no end date, just gone, because their due process was effectively eliminated.
That's terrifying. It really does sound like a massive assault on civil liberties, using process, or the lack of it, in a way that could spread far beyond non-citizens. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. A very common argument and narrative we hear constantly is that immigrants bring crime. It's used to justify tougher enforcement all the time. But what does the actual data, the comprehensive research, say about immigrant crime rates? Does it support that narrative or debunk it?
The data tells a very, very different story. It pretty thoroughly debunks that narrative, actually. When you look at who's incarcerated in U.S. prisons, illegal immigrants are about half as likely to be locked up as native-born U.S. citizens.
Half as likely.
And legal immigrants. They're about 70% less likely to be incarcerated than the U.S.-born.
70% less likely.
Yes. And it holds for serious crime, too. Take Texas, for instance. Both illegal and legal immigrants are significantly less likely, about 26% to 30% less likely to be arrested and convicted for homicide compared to native-born Texans. Nationwide, if you look at DHS's own data, only about 3% of the entire unauthorized or removable non-citizen population has any kind of criminal conviction.
Only 3%.
Compare that to the general U.S. population, where estimates suggest roughly 1 in 5 Americans has at least one criminal conviction of some kind.
1 in 5 Americans versus 3% of the removable population.
Yeah.
That's a stark contrast.
It really is. And it contradicts the idea that Immigrants are destroying our neighborhoods. In fact, studies often show immigration tends to increase home values in areas where immigrants settle. And the bigger picture, over the last 30 years or so, the U.S. has seen this huge increase in immigration, right?
Right.
During that same period, violent crime and property crime rates have dropped dramatically,
Right.
massively. Now, look, there can be legitimate debates about immigration challenges with assimilation, strain on some services, things like that. Those are fair discussions. But arguments based on, frankly, lies about immigrants being inherently criminal, those are completely illegitimate. The data just doesn't back it up at all.
Okay, that's incredibly clear. So given all this, the tactics, the conditions, the assault and due process, the false crime narrative, what do you see as the biggest threat right now, looking ahead? You mentioned a specific piece of legislation,
Yeah.
the Congressional Reconciliation Bill. What is that, and why is it such a concern?
Yes, that proposed reconciliation bill is arguably the #1 threat on the horizon regarding all of this.
So,
Essentially, this bill would give ICE and Border Patrol a blank check. We're talking multiple decades worth of funding essentially locked in.
a blank check for how much expansion?
Massive expansion. It would likely make ICE the single largest interior law enforcement agency in America, far bigger than it is now. Estimates suggest it could lead to detaining somewhere between 200,000 and 250,000 people at any given time.
250,000. That's more than the entire federal prison population, isn't it?
Correct. More than the Bureau of Prisons holds. And think about the resources. Projections show that by 2028, over 80% of all federal law enforcement funding could be going just to immigration enforcement.
80%. What does that leave for agencies like the ATF, DEA, FBI?
Exactly. It means potentially draining resources from investigating other serious crimes, drug trafficking, gun violence, terrorism, and there are huge concerns about the hiring surge this would require. Rapidly hiring tens of thousands of agents. Who are you going to attract?
Right. Quality control could be an issue.
A massive issue. You risk bringing in people with problematic backgrounds, maybe officers fired from other departments, individuals prone to corruption or abuse. We've seen issues like that in past hiring surges. And what does this mean for everyday life? Since other avenues for hitting those arrest quotas, like workplace raids, are already sort of maxed out, it inevitably means more racial profiling, more roundups in public spaces, streets, stores, neighborhoods. It would fundamentally alter the feel of law enforcement in communities across the country.
Oh, okay. That paints a pretty stark picture of the future under that bill.
Mhm.
Let's talk about the economics for a moment, too. Beyond the social and legal costs we've discussed, what are the actual economic impacts of this kind of anti-immigration stance for the U.S.?
Well, the economic reality is pretty straightforward. The U.S. economy simply cannot function, let alone thrive, without immigration, especially now.
Why is that?
We have major labor shortages across many sectors. And crucially, our domestic birth rates are declining. They're below replacement level. Right now, today, 100%, literally all of the net increase in the U.S. working age population is coming from immigrants. Without them, our workforce would be shrinking.
100%.
Yes. So the consequences of drastically reducing immigration are severe. It means higher costs for consumers because of labor shortages, fewer goods and services available, and it directly impacts fiscal stability. Social Security and Medicare would face bankruptcy much sooner without the contributions of immigrant workers and taxpayers. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, the nonpartisan scorekeeper for Congress, they estimated that the recent influx of people, even under the current administration's border challenges, will actually reduce the federal debt by nearly $1 trillion over the next 10 years.
Reduce the debt.
Yeah.
By $1 trillion.
Reduce it. Because these newcomers work, pay taxes, and contribute more than they consume in services over the long term, it leads to a pretty striking conclusion, really. Immigration is perhaps the only quote-unquote invasion in American history that has consistently made us wealthier and more prosperous as a nation. The economic data is overwhelmingly clear on that.
That's a powerful way to put it, and certainly contradicts a lot of the rhetoric. Okay, this has been incredibly eye-opening, and I'm sure quite alarming for many listeners. So for people listening right now who are concerned, who feel like they need to do something, what's your advice? What are some concrete steps people can take?
Yeah, it can feel overwhelming. I think it boils down to two main areas, personal preparedness and civic action. First, on the personal side, know your rights, seriously. Understand what constitutes proof of U.S. citizenship. A driver's license generally isn't enough.
So what's up? A passport.
A passport is best. Carrying it, or maybe a secure copy, can help. But look, that's a personal decision, right? How comfortable you feel. Also, crucially, Remember your right to remain silent if you're stopped by any law enforcement, including ICE or Border Patrol. You don't have to answer questions about your status or where you were born.
Right. The Fifth Amendment.
Exactly. Now, the decision about whether to carry proof of citizenship, like a passport, it's a tricky personal choice. For some people, maybe those with medical conditions who need identification, or people of color who know they face a higher risk of being profiled carrying it, might feel like a necessary safety measure. Others might choose not to carry it as a way of standing on principle, asserting their constitutional rights, refusing to live in a society where you constantly have to prove you belong. There's no single right answer. You have to weigh your own circumstances.
That makes sense. It's a personal calculation.
It is. But beyond personal steps, civic action is vital, especially regarding that reconciliation bill we discussed. If that passes, it will fundamentally change policing in every community. More profiling, more street roundups. It's not just an immigration issue, it becomes an everyone issue. So, getting informed about that specific bill, contacting your senators, your representatives, making your voice heard, that is incredibly important right now. That's where collective action can potentially make a huge difference.
So educating yourself on rights, making informed personal choices about ID, and engaging specifically on that reconciliation bill seem like key takeaways.
Well, this deep dive has certainly revealed, I think, a profound gap between the official story on immigration enforcement and the actual data. We've seen the troubling tactics, the inhumane conditions, and these really far-reaching potential impacts on civil liberties for everyone, not to mention the economic realities. Absolutely. And understanding the why behind it all, that these often aren't accidents, but deliberate policies aimed at specific outcomes, even if those aren't the stated ones, that's so crucial. And it underscores why informed civic engagement, staying aware and speaking up is just so vital right now. These policies really do affect the fabric of the whole country.
It leaves you with a pretty challenging thought, doesn't it?
Yeah.
What does it really mean for our society when the legal rights of one group are systematically chipped away? How might that erosion eventually undermine the rights and freedoms of all citizens? Where do we draw the line between demands for security and the fundamental liberties that define us? Something to definitely keep thinking about.